Okay, happy snow day, U.S. history people. We do have quite a bit of notes that we need to get done. So please make sure you move through this, finish out your notes so you can have the notes to finish your assignment. So I think this is where we were the last time we took notes. I had someone second hour ask me about Tuesday's bell question about the square deal. Everything that we have taken in our notes about, like the uh, Food and Drug Act, the Meat Inspection Act, that's all part of Roosevelt's Square Deal. And the Square Deal was fair and honest, and that the government would work to help the people. So make sure those of you that were asking that that's the answer to that question. All right, so this is where we ended up talking about water and the significance of water out west. And we're going to move on to in 1808, Roosevelt retired. Now, here's something that we didn't get to discuss because, again, we start in the middle of US history. But President Washington only served 2 terms. And up until this point, every president had never served more than 2 terms because President Washington had set a precedent that no one was going to do more than him. There's nothing yet in the Constitution that says a president can't do a third term, but no one ever has. So after he serves his 2 terms and a little bit of McKinley's, Roosevelt retires. He had his self appointed person that he wanted to come after him, William Taft. And he thought William Taft would follow through on the things that he had already set up, but he was sadly mistaken. They begin to disagree. In 1909, Taft approved the Aldrich Act, which didn't lower the tariffs as Roosevelt wanted. Now, remember, Roosevelt's retired, so he doesn't have anything to do with the running of the government. In 1910, Taft signed the Mann-Elkins Act, providing for federal control over telephone and telegraph rates, in essence, kind of setting up a monopoly for the government. But because it's for the telephone and telegraph that all people need, it was a positive. And then in 1911, Taft relaxed the hard line set up by the Sherman Antitrust Act. So Roosevelt's not very happy with him. And so um, they look at other areas that they disagreed on. And that would be Taft believed that a monopoly was acceptable as long as it didn't unreasonably squeeze out smaller companies. And again, this is maybe a little bit what Roosevelt talked about with good trust and bad trust. But at this point, Roosevelt's really upset with Taft. Taft fired Guilford, uh, Pinochet, and then overturned an earlier antitrust decision. And at this point, Roosevelt says, I'm going to run for president again, and I'm going to go against Taft. And this is always going to be a bad idea because what's going to happen is they're going to split the Republican ticket, and we'll see the outcome of that in our next set of slides here. Roosevelt promised to restore the government and trust busting in a new program that he calls New Nationalism. And what happens is Roosevelt split the Republican Party. And when that happens, Roosevelt says, I'm just going to form my own party then. So Roosevelt creates a third party called the Progressive Party, which makes sense. And it sets up a 3-way race for the presidency in 1912. Essentially, what Roosevelt has done is split the Republican ticket. And anytime that happens, the other party's going to win. If Democrats had done that, split the ticket, Republicans are going to win because and hopefully that makes sense to you, what you've done is made the Democrats or the Republicans choose between 2 people, and they split their vote, and the other party is always going to win. It's never a good deal. So, what did Roosevelt think that good government could do for citizens? After a number of weak and ineffective presidents, Theodore Roosevelt was a charismatic leader who ushered in a new era. Roosevelt passed Progressive reforms expanded the powers of the presidency and changed how Americans view the role of the president and its government. And that is a really important paragraph if I was thinking about what Mrs. Norris would potentially ask me on the test. So, all right, we're going to switch really fast and move over to our last set of notes, which is section 5. And we're going to look at President Wilson, evaluate what Wilson hoped to do with his program called New Freedom, describe Wilson's efforts to regulate the economy, and then finally, again, what's going to be on our test, assess the legacy of the progressive era. And this, again, will be what we'll spend quite a bit of time on. So in 1912, as we said in our last slides, the Republican Party was split between the progressives who backed Theodore Roosevelt and those loyal to William Taft. And as soon as that happens, it's going to allow Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, to win easily in the Electoral College, even though he does not receive a majority of the popular votes. And again, that is because the ticket was split. So who is Woodrow Wilson? Woodrow Wilson is a professor. He was also the president of Princeton University. And as a result of being president of Princeton University, which is located in New Jersey, he becomes the governor of New Jersey with a very progressive agenda. The other important part, excuse me, of Woodrow Wilson is he's our first Southern president elected in almost 60 years. He is also going to be, by the time period of which he lives, not by 21st century standards, a white supremacist. So you can imagine in 1912, if you're called a white supremacist, what that really looks like. He is going to overturn just about everything that Theodore Roosevelt and a few other presidents had done in trying to bring about a change for African Americans in the federal government and in the United States. Wilson felt the laws shouldn't allow the strong to crush the weak. Excuse me. So his New Freedom Plan was very similar to Roosevelt's New Nationalism, strict government controls over corporations. Wilson promised to bring down the triple wall of privilege: tariffs, banks, and trust. And so, in other words, he is looking for a way to reduce the power of all that big stuff that we looked at in the Gilded Age, that banks and trust and everyone that held a grip on the economy and the way business was done in the United States. So in 1913, the Underwood Tariff Act cuts the tariffs, leading to lower consumer prices. And this is really going to be the end of when we really talk about tariffs and understanding that they just economically don't really work for consumers. The Underwood Act also provided for the creation of a graduated income tax, first permitted in 1913 under the newly ratified 16th Amendment. And again, that's going to be a test question. That income tax, again, when they place that when they put that in business and begin taxing people, I believe that the only people that were taxed on their incomes were if you made over $5,000 a year, which in 1913 is a lot. Progressive like Wilson felt it was only fair that the wealthy should pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes than the poor, and that the revenue from the income tax would offset the tariff. So there had to be something that put money back into the government when they cut the tariffs, and that something was going to be a graduated income tax. And graduated means as you earn more money, you pay more taxes. And if I'm correct, this 16th Amendment said only people that earned more than $5,000 a year would actually even pay an income tax. And it was like that for a long time. I know now that you guys work, you have to file income taxes, even though you probably get most of your money back. But way back in the day, you didn't even have to file an income tax if you made less than a certain amount of money. So this is the other really important thing that Woodrow Wilson does, and it is significantly important, is he passes the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, and we finally create a stable banking system under President Wilson. It established a system of regional banks to hold reserve funds for the nation's commercial banks. Today, still in place today, it's still something that monitors, or it's still something that holds reserve funds. It protects against any one bank, any one region, any one person controlling interest rates. So the United States is divided up, I think it's into 9 regions. And of those 9 regions, there's like a main bank in each one of those regions that holds onto those funds. If you have a checking account and you actually have checks, I don't know how many of you actually have checks. When you look on your check, at the bottom, there's a series of weird looking numbers, and one of those numbers is a routing number. And if you read that number off to anyone in the banking system, they immediately know where you're from based on that number, because each of those numbers represents a region in the Federal Reserve. So that is a definite positive for Wilson in creating this Federal Reserve Act. Wilson again is going to strengthen antitrust laws. He focused on trusts that used unfair practices, and what he creates is the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, and it is created in 1914 to monitor business, to prevent monopolies, false advertising, and dishonest labeling. Today, most of the action that the FTC works in is in the stock market, kind of like what we talked with our GameStop the other day. The FTC regulates and makes sure that the stock market is honest and that there isn't anyone trying to manipulate that market. In 1914, the Clayton Antitrust Act defined specific activities in which businesses could not engage. So that, again, helps bust up those trusts. Roosevelt only opposed trusts that engaged in unfair practices. The Clayton Act also protected unions from being defined as trust. So now we get to the point where unions have a lot more options to organize as a result of the Clayton Antitrust Act. Wilson also passed several progressive laws that supported workers. And again, that will be one of the important parts of this progressive movement as well, protecting workers. In 1916, the Working Man's Compensation Act provided wages for temporarily disabled civil service employees. So the government can only do this with civil service employees. They can't do it with anyone else. They don't have that power to do so. And the hope is that when the federal government makes that decision to provide workman's comp, that it will eventually trickle down to other places. So in 1916, if you work for the government and you got injured, you would have wages provided for you. It'll take a while for the rest of the workplace to jump on with this, but it is an important part of working towards making the workplace a safer and more fair place. Also in 1916, the Adamson Act provided an 8-hour a day for railroad workers. And federal laws today protect workers who are hurt on the job and limit hours. And most places will do that as well. If you get injured on your job, you are eligible for workman's comp. Wilson did not always support workers, as shown in the Ludlow Massacre. In 1913, coal miners went on strike in Ludlow, Colorado. The company refused their demands, evicted workers, and so the workers said, okay, fine, we'll just set up a tent outside of your company. We're going to make it difficult for you to do business. You want us out of your houses? We're just going to set up tents. The Colorado National Guard was called. Guardsmen fired on these tents, killing 26 people. Eventually, Wilson sent federal troops to restore order and break up the strike. Now, on the test, you're going to be asked a compare and contrast about how Wilson dealt with these strikes, broke it up, sent in federal troops, versus how Teddy Roosevelt, and if you remember, Teddy Roosevelt said to the owners, well, then I'm just going to nationalize your coal mine and I'm going to take it over and I will work with the workers. So please make sure you know the difference between the way these two presidents dealt with strikes. So now we're at the legacy. Again, the legacy of this progressive era is huge. The progressive era had a lasting effect on the government, the economy, and society. Political reforms included the initiative, the referendum, the recall, the 19th Amendment. Progressive reforms gave Americans more protection, control over their private lives, control over businesses. And those are significantly important. An initiative is a part of the ability of people to put laws on the ballot so that if there is something that you feel your community or your state needs a law about as a citizen, you can get a petition and get that initiative on the ballot. Same with a referendum. A referendum does the same thing. A recall is that you can recall elected officials. To the best of my knowledge, the state of Indiana does not have a recall. The state of Wisconsin does, and not too long ago, there was a recall against one of their governors. In California, there's a recall. That's the way Arnold Schwarzenegger became governor of California. They recalled the current governor and then had an election and elected Arnold Schwarzenegger. So a recall works very simply. You get enough signatures that people don't like what the current elected official is doing, and once you hit that threshold of that number, you can hold an election and work to get that elected official out. The 19th Amendment, which we've spent a lot of time talking about. So here's a whole bunch of legislation and amendments. And again, this will be part of where you can get some of that information about the Tuesday Bell question for Roosevelt. So the Sherman Antitrust Act, the National Reclamation Act, the Elkins Act, Hepburn, Meat Inspection, Food and Drug, and 16th Amendment. That's the income tax. 17th Amendment, the direct election of senators, the Underwood Tariff Act, lowering the tariffs, the Federal Reserve, the Federal Trade Commission, Clayton Antitrust, 18th Amendment, and we'll talk about that in our next chapter, banning alcohol. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. Progressive management of natural resources has impacted our environment, including national parks, dams, and forests. Progressive legislation has profoundly impacted our economy with antitrust laws, Federal Reserve, consumer protection, and again, water distribution, which is always a very hotly debated issue. Many issues still remain involving dishonest sellers, unfair employment practice, and problems in schools, cities, the environment, and public health. However, progressives succeeded in establishing the idea that government can take action in these areas, and that was important. We started this whole chapter with that discussion. What can the government involve itself in the lives of citizens? Do they have the right to interfere? And progressives said yes, and it really changes the direction of what the government can and what the government will continue to do in the lives of its citizens. So lastly, what steps did Wilson take to increase the government's role in the economy? Woodrow Wilson used expanded power of the presidency to promote a far-reaching reform agenda. Some of Wilson's economic and antitrust measures are still very important in American life today. Incredibly important. All right, so that finishes up our notes. I'm going to close this up, and then I'm going to give a quick video on our assignment, our last assignment for this chapter that you should be working on both today, Tuesday, and tomorrow. Okay? So let me know if you have any questions, emails. I will be waiting at my computer to answer anything you have. All right? So have a great snow day, and I guess I won't see you guys until Thursday.